Hello, everyone. You're listening to Truth Cat Radio at truthcatradio.com. The current time is 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's East Coast, U.S. I myself am broadcasting from Chicago in the U.S. My name is Richard Kary, and this is Beyond the Matrix. I'd also like to say hello to JP and everyone at Wolf Spirit Radio. Thank you. We appreciate the simulcast on Wolf Spirit Radio and all of you listeners there as well. Tonight we have Keith Preston returning to the program. And we're going to be discussing a lot of interesting current issues, and I'm very excited to speak with Keith again. We're going to get to him in just a minute. I just first would like to mention to those of you who are or are not aware, we are completely listener supported. We don't accept any sort of corporate advertising, and we're not monetizing in any way. All our archives are free. But that being said, if you can, please support our station. We, can't really rely in the independent media these days on any sort of advertising, really. I mean, so many advertisers can get pressured, especially away from networks that are truly uncensored and display a truly unfiltered spectrum of opinions and information. We do have a PayPal option on our support page. If you go to our website, www.truthcatradio.com, a lot of people like the convenience, relative ease of PayPal, and any spare amount you can. A lot of people have a little bit, and they're like, "Oh, I don't really want to, give this if it doesn't really seem like, or an awkward, strange, oddball amount." A lot of those little extra amounts are what help keep us paying all the bills. Keep everything upgraded and running. So please, anything you can is greatly appreciated. And those who can give regularly and who do, we thank you immensely for your continued support to keep everything running here. And please like us on Facebook. We do most of our promotion through there. So if you could like our Truth Cat Radio page and pages for, it's a Truth Cat and Beyond the Matrix as well. It's a Truth Cat's news group as well. All those likes and shares help us out a lot. If anyone wants to call in tonight, the call-in number will be 714-598-3125. That number again, 714-598-3125. You can also reach us on Skype at stephen.d.kelly, K-E-L-L-E-Y, and tell them you want to join in and speak on the show. As I said, Keith has been on our program before. Just to give a little introduction, for those who aren't aware, Keith is the chief editor of attackthesystem.com. and the host of the Attack the System online podcast series. He's a founder and director of American Revolutionary Vanguard. He's been a contributing editor at altright.com and a former instructor of sociology. I know he studied sociology and criminology. Keith was awarded, and history. And Keith was awarded the 2008 Chris R. Tame Memorial Prize. This was from the United Kingdom, their Libertarian Alliance, for his essay, A Free Enterprise, the Antidote to Corporate Plutocracy. His dissections of power structures in modern liberal democracies continue traditions of thought going back to both leftist and rightist social critics of the past. Keith is also a former regional delegate for the Industrial Workers of the World and a former member of the National Committee of the Workers' Solidarity Alliance. Well, it's a very impressive resume you have, Keith, and thank you once again for being with us.
It's good to be back, Richard.
And that award you won, that's quite impressive. For that paper, I don't know how with the Libertarian Alliance, how they came across your work in the first place.
Well, that was actually a paper I did for a contest they were having. They were actually having an essay contest. And Sean Gabb, who was the director of the Libertarian Alliance at the time, he wanted to have someone address the question of whether libertarianism in practice would simply be a system of rule by big business, which is more or less what critics of libertarianism claim, certainly from the left and some from the right as well. I actually wrote an essay where I explained how modern capitalism or what's we might call corporatism developed. And I explained a bit about how the concentration of wealth that we see under corporatism would be impossible without the support that big capital receives from the state. And I outlined that fairly extensively. That essay is available online in multiple places, multiple different websites. So Sean was pretty impressed with the paper that I wrote, so he actually awarded me that prize as a result. They've actually changed their name now. The Libertarian Alliance has undergone a makeover. The new director is a fellow named Kerr Martland, who's a extremely brilliant young man. He's probably about 19 or 20 years old still, but he's actually assumed leadership of the Libertarian Alliance. You know, he has knowledge way beyond his years. And they've actually changed the name now to the Ludwig von Mises Center. But other than that, they're still around. All of their old archives are still around. But that's the backstory as to how that paper came about.
I was I was also recently reading your paper, "Conservatism is Not Enough: Reclaiming the Legacy of the Anti-State Left." And I think it's a brilliant history for a lot of people who are confused about a lot of these things. I don't know. I think our listeners would love to hear a little introduction to that, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. That is something that I wrote, I guess, in the late 90s, probably around 1999, maybe 2000, something like that. And what I was trying to do was address the strange political dichotomy we have in the United States, where conservatism is somehow supposed to be the party of anti-authoritarianism or anti-statism or libertarianism or something like that. And statism is considered to be an ideology of the left. Historically, that's not how it worked. Like, historically, the way it worked was that conservatism was the ideology of the monarchy, of the traditional hereditary aristocracy, of the theocratic churches of the kind they used to have in traditional society. And the left were those that wanted to dismantle all that in favor of either republics or democracies, or if you were more radical, socialism or communism or anarchism or something like that. So that's really how the whole left-right dichotomy evolved in history. In the United States, we tend to reverse that, and the reason why is that the United States was founded largely as a classical liberal nation. The American Revolution was probably the first of the great classical liberal revolutions of the 18th and 19th century. So the United States is founded on classical liberal ideals. So the United States has always been a left-wing nation historically. American-style conservatism is largely about preserving the legacy of the traditional merchant-based middle-class type society that we developed that came out of the American Revolution, defending the Constitution, the legacy of the American Revolution itself, against what is perceived to be encroachments from big government or socialism or communism or things like that. Which is why when you listen to mainstream discourse, for example, just the other day I was listening to a debate between the fellow that runs the Young Turks program, was his name Shank Younger or something like that, and Ben Shapiro, the neocon writer. And Ben Shapiro, who was a conservative, was talking about how, I'm against big government, I'm a libertarian, I'm an individualist. And the guy who was representing the left was more the apologist for the state and things of that nature. That's a total historical reversal of what left and right originally meant. But the problem, though, is that American-style conservatism, while it's historically on the left, it's still very much a reactionary philosophy by contemporary standards. And historically, political theory and thought has moved way past that, has moved way past this 18th century liberalism. And was always interested in philosophies that are historically rooted in the anti-state left, which has its beginnings with classical liberalism, but then veers off into anarchism, libertarianism, radical classical liberalism, and a lot of other overlapping philosophies. And on the website, attackthesystem.com, we go into that a bit. We talk about some of these ideas. So that's really what this whole concept of reclaiming the anti-state left meant. That meaning if you're against big brother government, it's not good enough to be a Republican. You really need to be something a little bit more radical than that.
And it's interesting when you point out how these days a lot of the alt-right movement can have more libertarian views than anything that's totalitarian, that people have been taught to associate with that. Well, I mean, there are a lot of associations of what the West defines Nazism as, and fascism, and these, I don't know, a lot of these words get thrown around more for just icons of propaganda more than anything.
Yeah, well, if we would want to dig deep into the realm of political theory, we'd have to go and trace some of this back a ways as well. But virtually all modern industrial societies, certainly in the Western world and even in many other places, today are liberal societies. I mean, of the roughly 200 sovereign nations around the world today, something like 2/3 to 3/4 of them are so-called democracies or semi-democracies. And when we say democracy in that sense, what we're really talking about is liberal democracy, which is the philosophical, political idea that came out of the Enlightenment. John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, Voltaire, Baron de Montesquieu, all of those people. Most modern states are liberal states, at least to some degree. I mean, even the Chinese are economic liberals. They're not political liberals, but all of the Western countries are certainly liberal democracies. All right. Now, most of the modern ideologies are derivatives of liberalism. They're really just variations of it. For example, what Americans call conservatives are really classical liberals. What Americans call liberals are really reform liberals or progressives. What Americans call socialists are really social democrats or radical reform liberals. And what Americans call libertarians are really radical classical liberals. So all of these points of view are really variations of the liberal philosophy. More or less what the differences are policy difference. Should taxes be higher or lower? Should there be more or less government regulation of business and industry? Should there be a public health care system? How much should the state provide for public education? Should the minimum wage be higher or lower? To what degree is the government justified in regulating personal behavior, whether it's gun ownership or drug use or same-sex relationships and things like that? But these are policy differences. And that's not to say policy differences don't matter, aren't important, or nobody should care about that. But all of these contemporary philosophies, for the most part, are derivatives of liberalism. Now, with communism and fascism and Nazism, that's not the case. All right, those are ideologies that emerged in the 20th century. They have their roots in 19th century and even 18th century thinking, but they really crystallized in the 20th century as repudiations of liberalism. Marxism or communism broadly, Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, all of that is a repudiation of liberalism. Hitlerism, Nazism is a repudiation of liberalism, as is fascism, Mussolini, and all of that. These philosophies were not reactionary or conservative in the sense that they didn't want to go back to the old order. They didn't want to go back to restore the monarchy and restore the theocratic church and restore the hereditary aristocracy. These were modern philosophies that accepted modern science, technology, industry. Some of them were anti-clerical and things like that. But they did repudiate liberalism, the idea that liberty is one of the highest political values for the individual, the idea of legal equality, the idea of representative government or democratic government, the market economy, all of the things that we associate with classical liberalism. Again, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, Voltaire, all that kind of stuff. fascism, communism, Nazism, the 20th century totalitarian ideologies are a repudiation of all of that. So that's the difference there. There's a tendency among a lot of American conservatives and libertarians, or what's passes as the right in the United States, to associate the left with those kinds of philosophies. Now that's, I think, is a problematic, to paint the left with a broad brush in that way. But that tends to be how American-style conservatives see it. They tend to see themselves, at least implicitly, as defenders of classical liberalism against leftist totalitarianism. The alt-right is a little bit different because that's a departure from mainstream American conservatism and is in some ways opposed to it. That point of view tends to draw more from the European right, which is more inclined towards either genuine reactionary conservatism, like throne and altar traditionalism. In fact, there's even a tendency among the alt-right, or that overlaps with the alt-right. It's called neo-reactionaries, and they basically argue that modern liberal democratic societies, republics, and so forth have been a mistake. That it was better when we had ruled by an oligarchical elite that was the caretaker of the society or something like that. Those are the kinds of arguments that will be used. There are some people on the alt-right who incorporate the criticisms of liberal democracy that the fascists developed, or the far right, the conservative revolutionaries and thinkers like that in the early 20th century. So the alt-right does overlap a bit with some of this more European style right, more than the American right.
And you've released a number of books. What would you like to mention most for the listeners to try to check out?
I have about half a dozen books available through a publisher called Black House Publishing. They're based in London. And I published my first book back, I guess about 5 years ago. It's just called Attack the System, and it's largely named after the website, but it's a collection of essays that I wrote over a period of about 15 years on a wide range of subjects, different ideologies, critique of the global system, political theory and strategy, things of that nature. I also have a number of other books that deal with these same topics. I have one book called The Tyranny of the Politically Correct, which, as the title says, is a critique of political correctness, and I have something of a unique slant on that. I have another book that seems to be fairly popular called Thinkers Against Modernity, and what I'm doing is I'm actually reviewing the work of thinkers from the past who critiqued modern civilization, thinkers like Ernst Jünger, Carl Schmitt, Friedrich Nietzsche, Julius Evola, and thinkers like that. I also have another book called Beyond the End of History, and that book is a sort of a rebuttal to Francis Fukuyama's thesis that history ended after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and universal and liberal democracy became the universally accepted political paradigm. And I've got a book on anarchism. It's called The Failure of Anarchism. I critique the modern anarchist movement, talk about what some of its limitations are. And I've also got a book on El Salvador. I actually wrote a book about the Civil War in El Salvador in the 80s and American foreign policy with regards to El Salvador at the time. I think for anybody that really wants to get a good understanding of how American foreign policy works on an international level, that book would be interesting, because what I do is I use the Civil War in El Salvador in the 80s as sort of a case study as to how to explain how American foreign policy works on a more general level.
Okay. Wow. Well, yeah. To the listeners, yeah, definitely check out Black House Publishing for all Keith's writing, all his books.
Yeah, you can also get the books from the website, from our website, attackthesystem.com as well. They're right there on the homepage where you can click on a link and order those. Okay,
and so anti-statism and principles that are, well, really, you embrace anarchy, I know, a lot in your philosophies as well. Something that some people don't spend too much time thinking about. But yeah, I mean, I think those descriptions you had right there of the libertarian origins should help in their understanding these things. I titled, I don't know what a lot of the listeners out there thought of my title, but Political Bipolarism and Duality of Man. I'm just suggesting how, I don't know, both on the right and left these days, there's a lot of people who are in the establishment seem to have just a lot of tendencies to go against what's traditional for their party these days. I don't know if it's more on a personal level, like the struggle of the mind, dualities that exist in each of us, or if this is more just orders, marching orders from someone else, who dictates most of their policies for them. But I don't know. It has gotten. I know, like some of what I was writing to you the other day. Many among the corporate political paradigm are far more extreme rather than logical. There's not that much intellectual thinking or analyzing these days. A lot of infighting. I mean, I don't know. Ever since Trump was elected, I think we spoke last right after he was. What do you think of what's gone on since then? I mean, it's just been kind of unprecedented, right? Just what we're seeing in Congress and toward Trump.
Well, what I think is interesting is the level of polarization that's developed in the United States. I mean, we had plenty of polarization before Trump was elected, but since Trump has been elected, it's really gone through the roof. And we see that the way that our society has become so polarized politically. The research that's actually been done on this shows that this is the time that American society has been the most polarized since the end of the Civil War, going back to about 150 years ago. So it really is amazing how polarized the society is. And it's also interesting to see just the level of acrimony and animosity that exists between the different sides. We see this both in the mainstream and on the margins. For example, if we look at the mainstream politics, we see the Democrats and Republicans, going at it like it's 1861 or something like that. As you said, particularly since Trump has come into office. We also see this going on the margins as well. More and more we're seeing incidents of street fights and things like that between the far right and the far left, the Antifa and the alt-right and all of these kinds of things. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds in the future. I see that continuing for a while. I don't know of anything that's on the horizon that could potentially have the effect of reducing some of the level of hostility and polarization that we see now. So it will be interesting to see where this leads in the long run.
Yeah, I was sharing that one story with you from, I believe it was Russia Insider, talking about how the Democrats are now fully on board with the war party. I don't know, as long as it's a way to critique Trump, then they'll go along with it suddenly. Generally, traditionally, the party more against war than the neocons. But it's just like anything that's against Trump has been the policy of a lot, even a lot of the Republicans, from what we've seen, right? I mean, like there's some orders that they're getting from elsewhere that supersede supporting the president.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see how the Democrats have gotten on this anti-Russia bandwagon. The Democrats are now starting to sound like Joe McCarthy from the early 50s. Everything is a conspiracy by the Russians to interfere in American politics and install a Russian-controlled dictatorship or something like that. That's now what the Democrats are implicitly claiming and sometimes explicitly claiming. And it's, in my view, all of that is completely contrived. It's something that the Democrats are using to deflect attention from the fact that their own party is such a terrible failure. The reason the Democrats lost the last election, in spite of the fact that they should have had every possible advantage on their side. I mean, they certainly had demographics on their side. They had the benefit of incumbency. They had the benefit of an outgoing president who had been a relatively popular president. They had the benefit of being able to promote the idea of the first woman president. They had all of these things that were going in their favor, and they essentially blew it. And the Democrats blew it because their candidate was just so weak, such a weak candidate. I mean, the real reason that Trump was elected was because Democratic voters pulled a no-show. Democratic Party's voter turnout was very, very low. And the reason, I mean, certainly compared to the two Obama elections. And the reason for that is that Hillary Clinton was just such an unappealing and unattractive candidate. I remember a few weeks before the election, I gave an interview to Press TV, which is an Iranian network, media network, television and radio network. And at the time, in all of the polls, Donald Trump was behind. Hillary was in the lead. And I was asked what could happen to turn that around and what could put Trump in the White House. And I said there were four things that could happen. One is that Democratic Party voter turnout would simply be very low, and that Hillary would lose for that reason because she just couldn't get out the vote. Another is that the third party candidates hurt Hillary worse than they would hurt Trump. We're talking about the Libertarians and the Greens and groups like that. Another thing would be that Hillary would fail to win the Rust Belt states, which have a very serious problem with high unemployment rates, job losses, things like that. And then the other thing would be that more scandals could ensue that Hillary became embroiled in. I think there was something else. I forget what the other thing was, but anyway, all of those things happened. All of the things that I had told Press TV a few weeks earlier could actually happen to put Trump in the White House did happen. Trump did win the Rust Belt states because Hillary neglected those states during her campaign. The evidence, I think, indicates that the third parties did hurt Hillary Clinton worse than they hurt Trump. And also the Democratic Party voter turnout was so low, and Hillary got into another email scandal right at the time of the election. So all of these things converged at once, and that is essentially why Trump won. Now, Trump is not a popular president by any means. Most credible research I've seen shows that he's one of the most unpopular presidents we've ever had. And he only won the election with the votes of 26% of eligible voters and 19% of the residents of the United States. So he hardly has a governing mandate. I mean, he's not leading a national unity government by any means. But I think, though, that we can attribute the fact that Trump is president to the failure of the Democratic Party. I mean, they had such a terrible candidate, and they had such a terrible campaign strategy on top of that. They ignored the Rust Belt states. They ignored the poor people in the inner cities and all of that. They tried to appeal to moderate Republicans and independents and swing voters and all of that by portraying Trump as an extremist, and it didn't work. They didn't address any issues of substance. They just made it all about personalities, and that's why they lost. And now they're trying to deflect attention from that. They're trying to blame it all on the Russians. The Democrats are saying, no, it's not because our party doesn't know what it's doing. It's because the Russians are interfering in everything. So that seems to be why they've adopted this hysterical anti-Russian line.
Yeah, I mean, we had that one article referring to California liberal Democrats imploding state. That's pretty extreme reference. I mean, yeah, it's like there are a lot of people who used to support the party. I mean, they don't like what they've been seeing lately, right? I mean, it's just been, just too, well, really just childish at this point.
Well, I think that the Democrats are going to have California as a locked-in constituency for quite some time. I don't see the Democrats becoming I don't see California becoming a Republican state. I don't see it by any means. I mean, California now is, for all intents and purposes, a one-party state, and it's going to stay a Democratic Party state. In the same way that the large American cities that have a majority African American population or majority minority population generally are almost 100% Democratic Party controlled, and have been for some time now. And that in turn reflects the level of political polarization that we have. I mean, California is one of the most left-leaning states that we have, and they're not going to vote Republicans in as a majority government anytime soon. So no matter how awful the Democrats get to be in California, I think they still are going to have a political monopoly. Our political system is degenerating into pure tribalism in the sense that it's a situation where people are going to vote for their party no matter what. Like in past times, it was not uncommon for swing voters to really be able to influence an election because there were a lot of people who would simply say, well, I'll vote for whatever candidate I like the best, whether they're Democrat or Republican. Nowadays, it's getting to be more the case where the Republicans, the Republicans are going to vote for Republicans, Democrats are going to vote for the Democrats. And it doesn't matter how extreme or incompetent or unattractive the candidate is. People vote purely along party lines. And of course, a lot of people just aren't voting as well. Voter turnout was way down in this last election.
And I mean that there can be a bit of cult-like thinking in the supporters of both the established parties, but especially anyone who supports Hillary these days. It really does seem like a personality cult. A lot of people refer to it as. I mean, I don't know. Most people can't support her anymore. Like you were saying. That I don't know. The amount of just. Well, I was sending you a couple of links about Maxine Waters, for example. She really doesn't seem to have much of a clue. I mean, I've heard other people quoting they don't understand why she keeps, remaining in office. She's referring to 700 billion losing coverage with Obamacare. I don't know where she gets that number. If she really is referring to, the population. We had just the amount of times she was interrupting in that one article that one gentleman who was trying to answer her. And that's when I referred to the childishness earlier. I mean, it really is a very strong cult on the Democratic side of those in power right now. But they, it was another, I know, was dissecting the contributions to Maxine Waters' campaign or her funds, collapsing and possibly a lot of fraud relating to funneling, laundering to her daughter. It just seems like a lot of corruption and a lot of cultism, especially on the establishment's left at the moment. Yeah, like you say, California is a very strong example.
Well, someone like Maxine Waters continues to get elected because she is popular with her constituency. I mean, for the constituency she represents, all she has to really do is play the race card. I mean, she is the same kind of politician as someone like Charles Rangel from Harlem, or someone of that nature, or like Al Sharpton. She takes a similar approach to Al Sharpton. For her particular constituency, as long as she plays the race card, she's going to win. And it doesn't matter how corrupt she is, or how stupid she is, or how incompetent she is. I've seen that in plenty of local jurisdictions in the United States. In the city that I live in, we had politicians for years who were heroin addicts, who were arrested for taking bribes, who were getting into all sorts of bizarre scandals, and people would vote them back into office anyway. We had one guy who was an attorney who was disbarred. He eventually went to federal prison for I think fraud or something like that. He would get reelected. In D.C., in Washington, D.C., in municipal politics there, for years they had a mayor, Marion Barry, who's deceased now, but he was voted in repeatedly over a period of decades, and same thing. I mean, he was arrested for smoking crack and all sorts of stuff like that. But that tends to be how politics works among the localities with a large African American constituency. You need a politician that's going to play the race card, and as long as they do that successfully, that works for them. Nothing else really seems to matter.
And then we have people funding this propaganda toward race, such as George Soros. It's been uncovered so many times how much he's been funding Black Lives Matter. There was an article pointing out Black Lives Matter costs University of Missouri millions, because after the sort of incidents there, they're just having just a ridiculous drop in the amount of enrollment over the last 2 years. So I mean, I don't know, people like George Soros, openly funding really a lot of these extreme radical social democrat agendas, like you refer to, and it's just acceptable by the establishment these days.
Yeah, well, Black Lives Matter is an interesting case because it's always seemed to me that movement was being funded by external sources. I mean, certainly there are a lot of grassroots level people that may participate in it, but I've seen a lot of really strange things going on with that milieu that I thought were questionable. For example, they had a number of people representing Black Lives Matter that got arrested here in the city that I live in. I'm in Richmond, Virginia. What they were doing was one of these standard protests where they're blocking the interstate in the middle of rush hour. And all of the people that were arrested, their photographs were posted in the local newspaper, the mugshots, and all of them were white people, except for maybe one or two that looked like they might be part white or something like that. So it's sort of bizarre to have a Black Lives Matter protest where there's no actual black folks. So that, and plus a lot of the people in the photographs just looked to me like they weren't from the normal activist milieu either. A lot of them, frankly, looked like drug addicts or seriously problematic people, troubled people. Mm-hmm. So I do suspect that a lot of the agitation we've seen under the banner of Black Lives Matter has been funded by external sources, and a lot of it does involve paying people to go out and do protests or do things that are disruptive and things of that nature. In fact, that was actually exposed during the campaign, during the presidential campaign by the Veritas Project, that the people close to the Democratic National Committee and so forth were actually going out and hiring unstable people to create disturbances and things of that nature. So that I think that's pretty well established now. I think that's what beyond simply being a conspiracy theory or speculation. It does seem to be something that's really happening.
Certainly.
As for I want to talk about what you're saying about the college, the Mizzou College. Yeah, that really hurt that school a bit because it really damaged the school's reputation. What you have to consider is this: college education is extremely expensive. I teach at a college, a private college, where the tuition is about $26,000 a year. So meaning if you're going to go to this particular college as a student full-time for 4 years, get a 4-year degree, you're going to shell out $100,000 plus. Not that many parents or others, not that many serious students want to shell out that kind of money to go to a school where there's nonstop rioting and things like that. That's just not what people who are serious about education want to be associated with. So it doesn't surprise me at all that this school's donations and enrollment and things like that would go way down. That's not what people that are taking education seriously are looking for.
We were mentioning, you were mentioning playing the race card in politics. I was amazed by that. One article pointing out Joe Biden caught admitting he wants to breed out the white race. So I mean, now we're even having white politicians who are going along with these extreme, racial. I don't know, how would you even describe that?
Well, I think it's pretty easy to explain what all of that is about. I think there are multiple factors at work. I actually gave a lecture some years ago to the National Policy Institute, which is a nationalist think tank, a controversial one because Richard Spencer is the head of it. But I actually gave a lecture.
All right, we had Daniel Freiber on the show before. Actually, I am a fan of Heinrich and Red Ice.
Yeah, I gave a lecture to National Policy Institute in 2011, I believe, but I think it was titled Mass Immigration and Totalitarian Humanism. Totalitarian humanism is a term I use as a euphemism or synonym for political correctness. But what I would actually outlined in that lecture was all the various forces that are driving mass immigration into North America and into the Western world. I wasn't in that lecture advocating for any specific approach to immigration policy per se. For example, if you watch that lecture, the video of it is available on I guess on YouTube or maybe some other websites. But I wasn't really debating immigration policy per se, as much as I was trying to explain the social and political and cultural and economic forces that are driving mass immigration. And what you see is a convergence of forces. You see big capital that wants a lot of immigrants as a source of cheap labor. If you flood the society with a lot of cheap labor, you push wages down. You don't have to pay workers as much. You see the political left who feels like immigrants would naturally vote for the left, being a disadvantaged group or groups or being a minority or something like that. So the political left wants to have mass immigration in order to strengthen its numbers. Obviously, ethnic lobbies and things like that want more immigration from their particular ethnic group. You also have social services and other state institutions that want more clients for their own services. You have more people who are going to be need to be educated in public schools or be on social public assistance and things of that nature. And then you have this ideological framework that says that universalism, the idea that the total blending of cultures and nationalities and ethnicities and religions and racial groups and all of these kinds of things is wonderful, and there's never going to be any kind of problem with that. And the more immigration we have, is fantastic, because we're going to be a more diverse and multicultural society, and that's human liberation and equality and all of these things. This whole ideological paradigm. There are a lot of people who really believe in that and really take it seriously as an ideological framework. Joe Biden, it doesn't strike me as a fanatical leftist. He's a fairly mainstream person, fairly moderate in his actual politics. I mean, he's definitely a liberal, but he's a moderate liberal. But I think that he would probably express enthusiasm for this idea for no other reason because he thinks it's going to keep his party in power for perpetuity. In fact, there was some years ago in England, there was a revelation that the Labour Party, which is more or less the British version of the Democrats, during the time that Tony Blair was the prime minister for the Labour Party, there were actually efforts made to try to flood England with immigrants on the grounds that the presumption was that they would vote with the left, therefore the Labour Party, and this would essentially create a one-party state under the rule of the Labour Party. And I think that the Democrats more or less have the same views as well. I think they view it as something that's really going to help their political future. I think that among a lot of Democrats and others further to the left, there's this view that the real enemy is whitey. The idea that American society traditionally was the WASP-dominated society, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And they have this idea, which is a very naive and very foolish idea in my view, but they have this idea that all we have to do is bring in more folks from elsewhere, more Asian people, more African people, more Latin American people, more Middle Eastern people, and then we're going to have a diverse and multicultural society, and nobody's going to be an ethnic majority, and therefore we're not going to have any more racism or racial oppression or things like that. Now, historically, that's not the way it works. Historically, multi-ethnic societies, multicultural societies, multi-religious societies are not peaceful places where everybody gets along. They tend to be places where there's a great deal of instability, strife, sometimes violence and civil war, or even without that, even if it doesn't go to that extreme, you tend to have a system where politics is all about voting blocks, assuming you have a democratic government, but it's all about voting blocks organized along demographic lines. A good example is Iraq. Since Iraq adopted a parliamentary system, that's what you see there. You see the Sunni vote with the Sunni, the Shia vote with the Shia, the Kurds vote with the Kurds, the different tribes and clans and sects within Islam and all of the different kinds of groups you have in a country like that. That's what they vote for. They vote with their tribe. And our system in the United States is becoming that as well. Not only do we have this polarization between the red team and the blue team that's kind of like a polarization between, Yankees fans and Red Sox fans or something like that. It's pure tribalism. But you also have these sub-tribes within the two big tribes. The Democrats and Republicans are essentially coalitions of political and religious and economic and ethnic tribes that are wanting to essentially use the state to gain favored legislation for themselves or use the state to repress their enemies or perceived enemies' interests. So it certainly makes sense that those on the Democratic side would be in favor of mass immigration simply as a means of strengthening their numbers. Now, on the Republican side, this is the case as well in many instances, because there are a lot of Republican business interests that are certainly in favor of mass immigration simply for the fact that they want to have the cheap labor. They want to have the skilled labor, tech workers imported from India and Asia and places like that, from China and Japan, Korea, as well as the unskilled labor imported from Latin America. So and you also have a lot of people on the right who are believers in open borders. America's the land of opportunity. A lot of neocon types have this view. A lot of libertarian types have this view. A lot of the religious right types even have this view. Immigrants are more souls to save and more potential church members. So I think that we see, when it comes to the immigration issue, we see certainly the elites of the two parties are pretty much on the same team. Now, that's shifted a bit since Trump has come into office, because he, claiming he was going to restrict immigration was one of the big things he ran on. But I think the immigration issue is really not so much a left-right issue. It's more of a popular issue versus elite issue. You have the elites on both sides of the political spectrum, both sides of the cultural spectrum, who generally have a very favorable view of open borders and mass immigration. And you have commoners, rank and file people who, on both sides of the political spectrum, who tend to have a more negative view of immigration. Now, obviously, there are individuals that are exceptions, but that seems to be how it breaks down. And it's the same way in Europe. I mean, if you look at the anti-immigration parties in Europe, you see that they tend to be more populist parties. They tend to draw certainly from the right, but also people from the left as well. One of the best examples is the Front National in France, Marine Le Pen's party. They are, have a right-wing history and background, but they also draw a lot of votes from the left. A lot of former communists now vote for the National Front, Front National, whereas Macron's party tends to have the support of the elite from both ends, the neoliberals and the neoconservatives. So it's more of a populist issue versus elitist issue rather than a left versus right issue.
And we're hearing that Trump is, changing a lot of these policies, both with immigration and with college admissions, right? Basically, removing a lot of the affirmative action that made things more unequal than equal. I mean, he's bringing back merit-based, both for immigration and for the college. I don't know, if it'll stick, but for now, that's what he's. So that was something he actually campaigned on. So it looks like he's trying to. The few things they are letting him have control over, that he campaigned on, he is trying to make progress on, right?
Well, yeah, I saw recently where the Justice Department was going to try to curb affirmative action in some ways. I don't know how far that's going to go. There's a lot of issues involved in that. I think that any challenges to affirmative action, and certainly in the university system, would go through the courts. They would go through the federal courts. And I suspect a lot of the federal courts would hand down rulings that dismantling affirmative action or undermining affirmative action is unconstitutional. And the logic they would use for that would be the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection under the law. Now it might be a dubious interpretation of the 14th Amendment, but I think a lot of federal judges would be in a position to rule in that way. They would rule that dismantling affirmative action violates equal protection under the law because because the intent of it ostensibly is to compensate for past discrimination by creating equal opportunity. That's the rationale that would be used. So I have my doubts about how successful an attack on affirmative action of that kind would be when you have the federal courts that are potentially a barrier to that. As I also saw where Trump was talking about implementing a more merit-based system of immigration, I could see that happening. I think that's more probable. Well, what's interesting is that if we look at the whole history of immigration policy in the United States, we tend to see something of a back and forth. Back in the early to middle 19th century, there was a lot of immigration into the United States from places like Ireland and from Germany, a lot of Catholic immigration, and a lot of people were very opposed to this. We had people that were very concerned about Catholic immigration, about Irish immigration, about German immigration, and sometimes for good reason. I mean, you had Irish and German immigrants that were forming violent street gangs in American cities. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, that's what that's about. So that was a big issue back in the early 19th century. By the late 19th century, there was a lot of immigration there then as well. That's during the Ellis Island period, and you had a lot of immigrants coming from Southern Europe, from Italy and places like that, and also from Eastern Europe, from Czechoslovakia, and what was Czechoslovakia back then, and Poland, and the Baltic countries and that. And a lot of people were very opposed to immigration of this kind as well from the Southern and Eastern Europeans. There was also a lot of Chinese immigration into the West Coast back then. And there was so much opposition to immigration that there was actually reversal of this. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act that was enacted, I guess in the early 20th century, that barred future immigration from China. And then there was also another more comprehensive immigration exclusion legislation that was passed in the 1920s, I guess about 1924, that for about 40 years, from the mid-1920s up until the 1960s, severely restricted immigration into the United States. Immigration was very restricted during that 40-year period. Then what happened in the 1950s, in the 1960s, around 1965, immigration laws started to become more liberalized, and also immigration from the third world in particular started to become more liberalized. And that's really why we have had the kind of immigration that we've had in the half century or so since then. That's why, for example, we see the population of people of color growing significantly in North America. So it's certainly conceivable that there could be a reversal of immigration policy to where we do go back to a more restrictive pre-1965 type of immigration policy. Now, I don't think it would go that far. I think it would still be more quote-unquote liberal than that because of a number of things. Number one is economics. Because we do have the global economy, because of the power and influence of a lot of international businesses that do want immigration. I don't think that the kind of immigration restriction that was enacted in the 1920s would make a comeback. But it's certainly possible that a more conservative or restrictive immigration policy could be enacted, that somewhat reverses the policy that was implemented in the 1960s.
Okay. Well, here in about a minute or so, we're coming up on our station break, just about a 5-minute break for station announcements. I don't know if you just want to just mute your microphone and just do anything you may need to do for a little pause.
Okay.
All right. And everyone, you are listening to Truth Cat Radio at truthcatradio.com. Today we are speaking with Keith Preston, who's back on the program once again. And Keith's going to be joining us once again, continuing into the second hour, rather. And please check out attackthesystem.com for more of Keith's work, his writings, links to his books, which I recommend you check out as well. And everyone out there, I would just once again like to say thanks for your support, and do what you can to help keep everything going here. We are completely listener supported, and any little bit will help with keeping everything running. I'd like to also say hello to our affiliates over at Wolf Spirit Radio. Okay, well, we'll be back in about 5 minutes, and then also stick around after my show for the Stephen D. Kelly Show.
Okay, I guess that's my cue. Yeah, this is Truth Cat Radio, www.truthcatradio.com, and we want to say hi to you people out there that are listening. Hi. Hello, everyone. Yes, we do ask for a lot of money all the time, and you guys that are regular listeners do hear it, but we have to keep doing it because this is the only way we could do it. Obviously, we would like to do a little bit more on Facebook, but yes, we do need your donations, so use our PayPal until we are large enough that we are able to have an LLC or something that will get a truthcat.com PayPal or something of this nature. But until then, we've got to use Stephen Kelly 714 at Gmail. That is our PayPal that we use. Okay. Now, if you would like to be part of Truth Cat Radio, get in touch with me, and the email to use for that is law17gun at AOL.com. That's law17gun at AOL.com. And please don't confuse that with the one we use for PayPal, because they don't interchange. In about an hour after Richard here, we will have the Stephen E. Kelly Show, and I will be having a special guest today that I did not announce who the guest name is because I was trying to avoid something. But when we do the show, you'll all understand why I did that. And we look forward to, well, I'm not trying to play games with your curiosity, but hopefully you will listen. But bottom line is, once the content is created, it gets out there on YouTube, you guys will have lots of fun with it. If you are listening to this show on YouTube, we also want to please ask you to give us a thumbs up and a nice comment. We love comments. And at the bottom of the show description there, underneath where you hit play, is going to be information on how you can also donate to our show or to all the shows here at Truth Cat Radio through our PayPal. And let's see, and again, if you are listening via the main page, the primary way that people listen to the show, go check out the chat room and register a screen name. If you are new to the chat room, hello. If you would like to comment or contribute or ask a question, you can do that through the chat room, or you can call in at area code 714-598-3125. That's area code 714-598-3125. Also, you can connect to us on Skype if you send a contact request to Stephen.D.Kelly. That's Kelley. And make sure you say that you would like to be on the show so that we know enough to connect you right away. Beyond that, I'm just going to remind everybody that this is Beyond the Matrix. It is Thursday. This is Truth Cat Radio. And it is August 3rd, 2017. Thank you very much.
And I guess that's my cue. All right. Well, hello, everyone. You are listening to Truth Cat Radio. And hello to everyone at Wolf Spirit Radio. And thank you, JP. We appreciate all of your listeners and our simulcast over there to all of you. And as Stephen said, please help us out with any donations you can. Yeah, it is a bit of a struggle sometimes, and kind of rough to keep having to ask, but if we stop doing that, it could just turn out that we can't afford to keep everything running. And please, as I said, like our Facebook page, and we have our Truth Cats news group and Beyond the Matrix Facebook page. All those shares and likes do help out a lot. We are going to be having Stephen D. Kelly, of course, with the Stephen D. Kelly Show coming up in about an hour today. on Beyond the Matrix. We are once again speaking with Keith Preston. And, well, it's been a rather interesting discussion so far. Hello, Keith. I'm sorry, am I pulling you back in too soon?
No, I'm here. It's
okay.
Good.
Okay, just making sure. All right. Well, yeah, I wanted to point out some of the articles I was seeing speaking about politics and the generations to come. You know, we have the millennials, of course, often referred to commonly as the snowflakes, and that they are very liberal leaning, generationally speaking. But then this generation to follow them, oldest now would be only about like 16 years old or so, is what the article is stating, and that's being called Generation Z. A lot of these articles had a lot to say about that first. I did want to mention the millennials. The millennials aren't ready. This one article states out of Government Slaves, the millennials aren't ready for the reality of life and suffer from panic attacks and anxiety problems. I don't know. What did you think of that assessment of that generation?
Well, what I think of that is I think it's actually a product of child rearing practices that have become common in the past few decades in the United States. During the I guess starting in the 1980s, but really it started to escalate in the 1990s. You had this practice of child rearing involving things like helicopter parenting, involving a very overprotective approach to child rearing, as well as this parallel emphasis on sensitivity and inclusiveness and things of that nature. These two things converged to sharply influence the way child rearing was done during that time period, and still continues to be done in many instances. And I think the end game of that, the end result of that, is exactly what you're describing, in the sense that it's essentially created a whole generation of people who are psychologically disabled. And as far as the background of that, in the 1980s and 90s, well, really, I guess starting in the period between the 70s up through the 90s, we had a serious crime wave in the United States. There was a lot of violent crime. It's gone down a lot in the last 20 years, although we still have fairly high crime rates, but for a modern Western country. But between the crime wave that existed, between the hysteria over drugs that came about in the 1980s, between some highly publicized cases of child kidnappings and child murders and things like that, between a lot of other, between growing awareness of things like child sex abuse and all of these different concerns came about, along with things like a growing concern about safety, making sure your kids don't fall off a swing set and bump their knee or something like that. And then with political correctness and with the cultural left really starting to become entrenched in American society during the same period, there was this growing concern about making sure no one ever gets left out, make sure everyone's included. All of these things converged to create a method of child rearing.
Yes, like the era where the participation awards.
That's a really good example. The idea that the kids on the team who get the trophies aren't just the kids who excel, who scored the most touchdowns or whatever, but everybody gets a trophy just for showing up or whatever, because we don't want anybody to feel bad because they didn't get a trophy, whether they did anything to merit a trophy or not. That's one example of this that's commonly thrown out. But there are a lot of other things that are actually far more serious, in my view. I think that the main problem with this approach to child rearing is that you have a whole generation of kids that grow up who simply aren't able to cope with life, because they're used to having someone there to hold their hand whenever something goes wrong, or they've been told that any problem they have is not their fault,
or whenever they've had some kind of problem, somebody steps in, their parents step in, or their school steps in, or their counselor steps in to take care of the problem for it. A good example of that is the obsession that you see with bullying now that goes on in schools. I don't have children of my own, but I know people who have children who are in school, and they say nowadays they take kids to all of these seminars about the evils of bullying. And I remember when I was a little kid being in the first grade, I was like 6 years old or something, getting bullied. And I remember telling my parents about it, and they say, well, you've got to fight your own battles, son. That's how it works. Get used to it. It's life. And that's kind of how I grew up. I was from that. I was born in the '60s. But I grew up before this kind of stuff started becoming prevalent. And I occasionally I see memes on Facebook where people talk about how when I was growing up, I was a latchkey kid, or I played on the swing set, or I rode a bicycle without a helmet, or I played tackle football and got hurt or whatever. And I turned out fine. And that's kind of what my generation was like. My generation, and certainly the generations before mine, we didn't really have all this emphasis on, on sensitivity, on inclusiveness, on holding everybody's hand through life, on helicopter parenting, on safety at all costs. When I was a kid, we had what we called latchkey children. These were kids that would get off the school bus and they'd have they'd have keys to the house and just let themselves in because their parents were still at work and wouldn't get home until later in the evening. And I knew a lot of kids that were growing up that essentially raised themselves in many ways. I wasn't really like that myself. My upbringing wasn't that extreme, but I know plenty of middle class kids that grew up this way. But there has been a reversal, I think, of child rearing practices in the last few decades. That, as I said, it's essentially created people who were psychologically disabled in the sense that they cannot deal with life's inevitable problems. They haven't experienced enough adversity in life. They haven't experienced enough disappointment. And I'm not talking about real suffering. I'm not saying that it's good for children to grow up in an environment where they're beaten or where they suffer extreme poverty or anything like that. I'm saying that people have to learn early in life that disappointment is an inevitable fact of life. Having people around you that you find disagreeable is an inevitable fact of life. Having people that don't like you is a fact of life. Experiencing failure from at least time to time is a fact of life. All these other things. I think there's a whole generation now that has always been told that these kinds of things are not their fault, or when they happen, they have, their, like I said, their parents, their teacher, their guidance counselor, somebody stepping in to help them out with this. And they come from this generation where everybody gets a trophy for showing up and sitting on the bench. What we're seeing now is that being transmitted into adulthood. We see children that were raised that way, trying to function as adults in a way that they can't. They're just not capable of functioning as adults and dealing with real life responsibilities and real life frustrations and real life disappointments and having to work as a team in a group, and having to deal with people in an environment where there's rules and there's structure and where, for example, if you in the workplace is the obvious example. I mean, if you go to the workplace, your boss doesn't give a damn, whether he's being insensitive to you or not. He only cares about the bottom line, and that's just how the workplace is, in any kind of workplace. And life is like that. I mean, you're always going to experience frustrations in terms of not getting the job you wanted, or not getting the raise you wanted, or the girl you want to go out with doesn't want to go out with you, or whatever the problem is. People experience that all the time, and that's just how things are. And we have a generation now that is unable to accept that. They think that the problem is with society or with the other person, or they just don't understand that these are just inevitable facts of life, and their psychological coping mechanisms haven't been developed well enough that they know how to deal with these things.
And then there were several articles on this Generation Z. And like I said, that the oldest of them would be about 16 years old, 16 going on 17, at most now. Like the one was called Kids These Days, but the general theme of a lot of these, which some of them were entitled Generation Z, leans more toward the right, is more conservative Then millennials, one's even stating the most conservative since World War II. So yeah, there's definitely a shift, a swing of the pendulum then from the millennials considerably within just one generation. But then children do tend to rebel. So do you think that's part of it? You know, just that psychology from one generation to the next?
I wouldn't put too much faith in these polls.
Right. I mean, these are very young people who can't
Right.
really have formed their opinions yet. Their brain's still developing until the mid-20s. So
Yeah, someone who is 16 years old or younger has no real opinions. You know, I mean, when I think about opinions I may have had when I was that age or younger, I mean, it's not very little of that is any reflection of who I am now. So the thing about that is that children, we're talking about people who are still adolescents or younger. Children tend to follow the norms of the people around them, and they are essentially they are adopting the ideas that they get from their parents and things like that in many levels. If they tend to be more conservative and they come from a more conservative household. Now, there might be an element of rebellion in the sense that because in our society, the liberal paradigm tends to be dominant, at least among the elite, at least among the educational system, the media, certain institutions, maybe not all institutions, but certain institutions. I do think that there may be an element of rebellion that while for the millennials, for example, it got to be where being pro-gay marriage and being liberal about gay issues and gay rights and and transgenderism and all these kinds of things, that was really sort of became a status symbol. It's sort of like if you're a gung-ho pro-gay marriage person and you fly your rainbow flag or whatever, I mean, whether you're personally gay or not, that shows in their minds that you're on the right side of history, that you're an enlightened person, that you're a liberal-minded person, that you're a tolerant person, that you're a progressive-minded person. You see a lot of that with that generation. In fact, I think the gay issue, as much as anything, is something that really that generation latched onto in that way. For the generation that's slightly younger, they may just see all that as, well, what's the point? I mean, somebody who's 16 years old today has grown up in the era of gay marriage and transgenderism and certainly political correctness and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, these standard liberal ideas are normal to them. That's something that is part of the mainstream society. These are not fringe ideas to them. I didn't even know what transgender people were until I was in my early 20s. That's not true for the generation of today. Right. I think that in many ways, a lot of these younger people may just look at it like, well, what's the point? What's so great about all that? And it may be, at least for some of them, it's rebellious to be conservative or to be on the right. That seems to be the case with a lot of people in Europe. I've come across a lot of younger people in Europe who are on the far right, into neo-fascism or whatever. And it's interesting to see how many of them actually come from liberal backgrounds. Like their parents were actually liberals, even leftists in many instances. These are not people who were taught these particular views by their families as much as, or their school, whatever. They discovered this on their own, and in part because it was a rebellious thing to do. They grow up in an environment hearing about how, say, the European civilization has to atone for its past sins of colonialism and racism and all these kinds of things, or in the German culture, they have to atone for the Third Reich, or they have to, or in the United States, where it's we have to atone for slavery or segregation or gay discrimination or whatever. I think a lot of kids who have grown up with the modern liberal paradigm just look at it like, well, that's the establishment, So if you want to give the finger to your parents or your school or your authority figures, then put up a swastika or something, or maybe not go that extreme, but become a conservative of some kind. But I wouldn't really use any of these surveys as a means of trying to predict the future. Now, for one thing, I've been hearing this kind of stuff for generations now. I remember way back in the early 80s, you had a lot of commentators, particularly people on the right, saying, Today's generation is far more conservative than the 60s generation. The 60s are dead, and now we're going back to conservatism, and pretty soon we're going to be right back where we were in the 1950s. That never happened. American society certainly, and European society too, have increasingly become more and more liberal during that time. And I've been hearing that a lot about how the next generation is going to be more conservative. I don't really think so. I think that the next generation probably may not be as inclined to some of the extremes that we see now. For example, these social justice warrior people that we see staging protests on college campuses about cultural appropriation because they serve tacos in the cafeteria or something, and that's appropriate culture. Generation Z might not have any enthusiasm for that kind of stuff. They might think, well, that's stupid, but that doesn't mean they're going to join the alt-right or necessarily become Trumpians or whatever the equivalent would be for their generation.
And when you mention some of the rebellious trendiness in Europe of the young people who are inclined toward the alt-right, it also makes me think of some similar things we've had in America. I know like a big media darling was that Milo Yiannopoulos or whatever. And I don't know, I think he gave a lot of people just a negative image of the alt-right through his representation of the alt-light. And I mean, this, I don't know, just, it's very compromising, compared to traditional values and morals of people on the alt-right. This young, relatively, I guess just, not as constrained, to a lot of, as I said, these values. And, well, of course, he's very, I know, like pro-Israel and trying to almost, make everyone get along, really. It almost seemed like a bit of a psyop to me. Because also how much attention he had, like I say, from the media, in spite of being I guess alt-right could still be considered alt-right. I'm not really sure I buy it. I kind of think it's more, something generated from elsewhere, more than a real movement.
Yeah, well, but see, someone like Milo Yiannopoulos is a good example of how far left the American culture has shifted in recent decades. The fact that somebody like that is considered to be a representation of conservatism of any kind. I mean, some flamingly gay guy who brags about his black boyfriends and things like that. I mean, and this guy is considered a conservative. I mean, someone like that would not have even been allowed in the media just a few decades ago. And the idea that some person like that represents conservatism would have been considered farcical. But the fact that a guy like that is actually considered to be conservative and actually considered something of a conservative hero because he's standing up to left-wing political correctness or whatever. I mean, that really does show how leftward I think the culture has shifted. On one hand, we've got the left, the folks who are upset because there are tacos in the cafeteria, and that's progressivism. And then we have this guy who says, this flamingly gay guy who talks about, sex with black guys and things like that. This is conservatism. He's saying, well, what's wrong with the tacos in the cafeteria? That's how the left and right break down in terms of popular culture. Even among the more harder alt-right, though, you see this kind of issue. I know another time I mentioned I had spoken at the National Policy Institute at one occasion. I spoke there another time, more recently, a couple years ago, and there was actually a controversy there because one of the speakers on the panel, on the program, was a gay guy, Jack Donovan, who's written a lot about masculinity or what he calls androphilia and all of that. The fact that this openly gay guy was going to be speaking at the National Policy Institute, which is an alt-right think tank, it's Richard Spencer's think tank, that actually created some controversy too on the right. You had some people from the more traditional right, as well as some people from the white nationalist milieu, saying they were going to boycott this particular event because he was there. The alt-right, I think, is, on one hand, it's interesting because it's more
extreme than the conventional American right in many ways, but it's also more left-leaning than the conventional American right. Like what the alt-right tends to do. I mean, the alt-right is very diverse. It's a lot of different kinds of people with different ideas. It's hard to really pigeonhole what the alt-right is. But the alt-right, on one hand, is to the left of the to the right of the Republicans on issues like race, immigration, sometimes gender relations, things like that. You have the MRAs and all of that kind of stuff that are part of the alt-right configuration. On the other hand, the alt-right, at least in my experience, tends to be a lot less religious. People on the alt-right, if they're religious at all, they tend to be traditional Catholics or they're converts to Greek Orthodoxy or something like that. You see very few of these evangelical Protestant fundamentalists among the alt-right that you find, say, among the normal Republicans. You also see among the alt-right, I wouldn't say acceptance, as a more of a general tolerance of, say, gay people. Like they're okay with gay people as long as they're on their side politically, that kind of thing. That homosexuality isn't as big of an issue for the alt-right as it is for, say, the religious right. I don't see.
It's not a political priority, basically.
Right. Yeah. You don't see the fixation on abortion among the alt-right that you do among the religious right. So in many ways, in some of these ways, also the alt-right tends to be more anti-war, and they also tend to be more sympathetic to left-wing economic policies. In fact, I would say the alt-right probably is to the left of the Republicans on virtually all issues. Except,
I'm sorry.
Rate. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh no, maybe I made it sound some way I didn't mean to, but I just meant no matter what the current state of affairs is, whether they prefer the current laws for gays or not, it's just not a big issue for them to fight over. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'd say my experience with people, of all the people I know from the alt-right, and I've been a part of that milieu, or at least peripherally connected to it for years since it started. My experience has been that people on the alt-right are generally more left-leaning on most issues, except race, except immigration, and except gender issues in some instances, and also elitism. There's a lot less admiration for, say, democracy on the alt-right than there is among the more mainstream right. For example, to most 100% alt-right people that I know of, either personally or by reputation, they would think the idea of going to war with a foreign country to establish democracy in that country was the stupidest idea ever.
Right.
It's a whole lot of Republicans that would really beat the war drums for that. Yeah, we're liberating the world. So the right is more right-wing in that sense. It's more elitist. It's more racially conservative. It's more immigration critical, somewhat more sexist or male centric, if you will, phallocentric, I suppose, than the normal conservatives, or certainly the left. But other than that, I say they're probably more to the left on more issues than compared to the normal conservatives.
And then, you had mentioned earlier, touched on the topic of Russia and the way the media is trying to focus on that sort of hysteria, and they're trying to connect it to Trump. A lot of people say it's been traced back to when Hillary lost the election. She needed something to blame it on because she didn't want to admit that. Because when they have been checking into a lot of voter fraud, even from what they have been able to uncover, it does seem like Trump even did win the popular vote. A lot of people who got counted in multiple states, a lot of dead people who were votes in Hillary's favor, just an extraordinary amount of fraud. And then a lot of states are refusing to turn over right now information which would yield more. So, it is just a very believable, I'd say, to me as well, idea that this is Hillary behind. At this point, regardless, the media is going crazy with all of this, Russia. A lot of polls are showing most viewers are really tuning out at this point. They've just been saying the word Russia so many times per day. It's just ridiculous. And we've had this one story, American Pravda went undercover, getting CNN producer to admit the Russian narrative was, just complete bull, is the way they were putting it. So I don't know. Yeah, well, I don't know. It was a pretty powerful clip. I don't know if you got a chance to check that video out.
I haven't really had the chance to look at the video you're talking about, but the general narrative, though, that you're describing is absolutely correct. I mean, the Democratic Party really got kicked in the face hard. They thought that that Hillary Clinton was going to be a shoo-in as far as winning the White House, particularly after Trump became their candidate. From my observations, I think initially the Democratic Party was thrilled when Trump became the Republican nominee because they thought, well, he would be the easiest one to beat. And of course, when it didn't work out like that, they were like, well, what happened here? Well, it can't be our fault. Surely, somebody pulled the rug out from underneath us or something like that. And the Russians have just become an easy target. If anything, I would say that the Democrats have almost become the reactionary party or the right-wing party in American politics on many issues. If anything, they seem to have in many ways become more hawkish in foreign policy than even the Republicans are in many instances. They've become much more or just as defensive of corporatism in terms of economic policy. I mean, yeah, they're still cultural leftists in the sense of the LGBTQ configuration and all that, but that's really where their liberalism or leftism ends nowadays. They've become essentially a reactionary party that represents a status quo that it has no interest in popular issues. I mean, there was one of the most interesting articles I read in the time leading up to the last election was an article that appeared in one of the British papers about Bill Clinton, about how Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton had apparently had a very intense telephone argument shortly before the election, where Bill Clinton was telling Hillary that she was blowing the election, that she needed to get out and campaign in among the working class voters in the Rust Belt states and among the poor black people in the inner cities, because these are the people who were going to vote for the Democratic Party if they're going to win. And that she was wasting too much time focusing on Trump as a personality and trying to get disaffected Republicans to vote for the Democrats and things like that. And of course, it turned out he was absolutely correct in his assessment there. But I think that though that's really a problem that the Democrats have, is that they are they are the elite party in the sense that they represent the neoliberal economic paradigm. They represent this kind of political correctness in the social paradigm. When that is challenged from the bottom on a popular level, they don't really know how to react to that. They have no means of reacting to that. They don't want to change any of their directions. In fact, they said that. They said, we like the way the party is just fine. Some of their leading figures have said that. So I think that instead they're looking for scapegoats. They're looking for someone to blame. The Russians are an easy target. It's interesting, though, how they have become so obsessed with this. Some of the Democratic-leaning news channels, that's 24/7 anti-Russia now. You would think you were listening to Iranian media talking about Israel or something, or something like that. It's such a fixation.
And we're hearing that the rest of the world more and more is is just fed up with backing up the U.S. on things that will not benefit them whatsoever. The rest of the world doesn't want any sanctions on Russia. They think enough of this. They can see it's all economic interests of the U.S. and we're not getting as much cooperation from what I'm hearing.
Well, yeah, that's important because there's a major split now that's emerged geopolitically on an international level. Now, it's important to consider that all of the major powers are part of the international global system. I mean, the Russians, the Chinese, all of those countries are part of the G20. I call it the global capitalist empire or whatever you want to call it. Some people call it the New World Order. That's fine. call it whatever you want, but the global system, the global corporatist system, includes all of these major powers. But you have this geopolitical rivalry within that system that's breaking down now along certain fairly distinctive lines. You have what was at least has been the dominant coalition, and that's the American-led coalition, which also includes the NATO countries. It includes Israel, it includes Saudi Arabia, it includes the Gulf states and the Sunni nations that are aligned with Saudi Arabia, and then it includes the American allies in the Pacific, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, the Philippines, Australia, all of that. That's one coalition. And then you have the other side, which is, I think, more and more giving the dominant coalition a serious challenge, and that is I've called it the triangular resistance, because what I mean by that is it's sort of a triangle between the BRICS nations, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, India, the BRICS nations, and then the Shia bloc, the Iranian-led Shia bloc in the Middle East, which also includes Syria, which includes Hezbollah, which includes the Houthi in Yemen. And also the global south. We see more and more the global south is turning towards the east when it comes to looking for allies or assistance. The Chinese, for example, have really gotten involved in economic development in Africa. More and more of the Latin American countries are turning eastward. They're creating their own trade blocs and trade agreements with nations like China, like Russia, and away from North America and Europe. So you see this kind of triangular relationship between the BRICS, the major Eastern economic powers, and the Shia bloc and the global south on one hand that are starting to challenge this kind of Atlanticist. I call it the Anglo-American Zionist Wahhabist axis, or the Atlanticist Zionist Wahhabist axis on one end. And I think that Russian foreign policy is calculated towards this end. I think that Putin, as far as Russian foreign policy, I think the Russian foreign policy is a traditional Russian foreign policy. They see their legitimate sphere of influence as being Central Asia and Eastern Europe as buffer zones, and the United States is trying to encircle Russia by planning military bases and expanding NATO right up to Russia's border in Eastern Europe, and then also creating a network of bases in Central Asia as well. And I think Russia is trying to counter that by building this kind of de facto Eurasian alliance against the Atlanticist powers, through their collaboration with the BRICS, through their moving closer to Iran, through adopting Syria as an ally, through the DPRK, through also their relationship with the global south. And also the Russians have become interested in supporting dissident movements in Europe and even in North America. They've even had good words to say about the Texas independence movement and things like that, Cal exit and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's really how the international relations are breaking down. And I do think that, more and more people around the world, it's interesting in the sense that it's getting to be almost like what happened during the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was still together, people around the world in the former colonies, that is, the nations that had been part of the, or still were, part of the old European colonial empires, they started looking to the Soviet Union and to Maoist China for leadership or assistance in terms of breaking away from colonialism. And that kind of thing is happening once again, in the sense that you have the global south and the nations of the Middle East and South Asia and all of that, Africa looking towards Russia, towards China in the same way they did during the Cold War, sort of the global leadership against this kind of Western neo-colonial hegemony. So it's almost like the Cold War never really ended. The Soviet Union ended, but the geopolitical paradigm that came out of that didn't.
Well, I know that there's a lot of collaboration with China and Russia, systems of trade now existing outside of SWIFT, just complete, and we're having a lot of gold-backed currencies from these countries that the U.S. isn't able to compete with at this point, and so I don't know. Perhaps some of the Russia bashing was trying to be a cover for Hillary's results at the polls, but it seems like this economic agenda against both Russia and China is something that in the long term the U.S. has no choice as far as the U.S. government. I mean, the people will just be lied into whatever they need to be lied into, right? But too easily, I mean, these economic wars can turn into hot military wars. Isn't that right?
I actually have a somewhat unique take on that I haven't seen a whole lot of other people state, and that is, I think that the American elites are divided into rival factions, just like the general public is divided into rival factions, and the Republicans have in the past been led by the neocons, the neoconservatives, who have this, benevolent global hegemony agenda, and whereas the Democrats tend to be liberal internationalists. I actually think that a lot of the Trump people, a lot of the people who initially were backing Trump for president, I'm not talking about rank and file voters. I'm talking about elites, people within the ranks of the elite who were backing Trump. A lot of those, I think, were people that did want to pursue a different kind of relationship with Russia. For example, a lot of the foreign policy ideas that the Trump people brought with them, I think, were formulated initially by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That is a think tank in Washington. It's associated with Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who recently died, but Kissinger and Brzezinski were the two most prominent individuals associated with this foreign policy think tank. And also Rex Tillerson, who was the CEO of Exxon and now the Secretary of State. He was also associated with this think tank. But it seems to me that the Center for the Strategic and International Studies had developed an approach to foreign policy where they were more about trying to develop a more a cooperative relationship with Russia, I think in part to diffuse this alliance that's developing on an international level between Russia and the global South and Iran and China on one hand, and also for the purpose of cooperating against terrorism, which both countries have something of a stake in combating. I think that some of the more intelligent, the more serious, the more realistic ruling class strategists among the American elite, the ones that are, that really represent the elite proper, like Kissinger, like Brzezinski. I think some of these people had this idea of moving closer to Russia when Trump came in. Now, I think that created a conflict between this point of view and what's been called the deep state, which is the deeply entrenched intelligence and military and other services that are not part of the elected branches of government, but they're part of this ongoing security bureaucracy. I think these elements see Russia as a primary enemy. They see the Iranians and other states in the Middle East that are that resist being incorporated into the Washington Consensus. I think they see all of these as a primary enemy. And that, I think, created a real battle in the White House, in the presidency, in the executive branch of government. It looks like what has happened is that the deep state has won, at least partially, at least on certain things. For example, when Trump attacked Syria, I had the feeling that meant that the deep state was getting the upper hand, in the sense of because those elements are certainly very opposed to Syria and support regime change throughout the Middle East. However, it's also interesting that Trump has now apparently pulled back on Syria as well. So that maybe something has shifted there. And on Russia, it seems that Trump has become increasingly hostile to Russia, which leads me to the conclusion that the geopolitical strategists that are most closely aligned with the deep state are probably getting the upper hand now in the executive branch. A lot of that is speculation, but that seems to be what's going on. I think the dominant consensus among the elite is they want to strengthen the position of this Atlanticist, Zionist, Wahhabist axis against this emerging Eurasian alliance. I think there are other more realist-oriented people among the elite who don't see that as a long-term plan that's a very good idea. So that seems to be a real foreign policy conflict now that's going on among the foreign policy elites.
And you mentioned the deep state. There was another interesting YouTube video I know I sent you about the Clintons and the DNC. Newt Gingrich was mentioning, actually, of all people, that he's suggesting why Congress and a lot of what we've seen, from statements of Comey and the like, why Congress won't investigate the corruption of the Clintons with the email scandal and all that. Basically saying, there's too large of a Clinton body count, basically, and she knows all the secrets, and so many of these people that, it's almost like she's untouchable. It's I don't know, it's kind of disappointing, where at this point, a lot of people do want to see this investigated. Comey went through the list of charges that she's guilty of, and then said, well, something that he has no authority to make the call on. That we're recommending to not proceed. But I don't know. I coming from Newt Gingrich as well. I don't know. I thought it was a pretty powerful video, but I'd have to say it would hard to be able to argue against that. It seems pretty logical.
Yeah. Well, Trump. Newt Gingrich is as closely connected to the DC insiders as anyone. He's someone that likes to work different ends against the middle. He tends to go with where he thinks the main chance is at the moment. In more recent times, he's thrown in his lot with Trump because he thinks that's the wave he wants to ride at present. But I do think he's probably right in the sense that the Clintons are the Democratic Party. The whole Clinton machine is the Democratic Party. And there are certainly plenty of Clinton loyalists that are planted all throughout the bureaucracy, throughout the Justice Department, throughout the intelligence services and all that. And it's also important to remember that, the Clinton apparatus is strongly aligned with plenty of Republicans. There are plenty of neocons who at least implicitly gave their support to Clinton over Trump in this last election. And a lot of that is entrenched in the bureaucracy as well. You have guys like John McCain, for example. He's certainly a part of all of that. So there's no reason to think that that anybody that has any real access to positions of power in the government would want to go and investigate the Clintons. I don't think they would investigate a prominent Republican either. I think that ultimately, when it comes to these kinds of things, the power elite or the ruling class or whatever you want to call it circles the wagons, and they protect their own collective interests, whatever they may think of each other at any particular time. So I think it's very unlikely that there would be any investigation of this type.
And then, let me see here. Just looking at the time, we have about say 10, 15 minutes left. I don't know. I had a few other just stories just to mention briefly, but I don't know. I'm not sure what else you wanted to perhaps cover with the listeners before with the time we have left here.
Yeah, well, it's there's a lot of things that we need to keep in mind, I think, when we look at all of these issues. One thing that I'm actually very disdainful of is the way in which this partisanship or this polarization has become so extreme to where it's being played out on the grassroots level, on the popular level. More and more the whole Democrat versus Republican thing is just, like I said earlier in the program, it's like the Yankees versus the Red Sox. It's just people rooting for their team. It's not even anything that has any substance or meaning. And on the extremes, on the margins, it's getting a lot worse. I think that when it comes to any real problems we have in society or things like that, we need to start thinking past all of these kinds of things. We need to start thinking past this whole Democrat, Republican, red team versus blue team way of looking at things. We need to get past what I call the who's most oppressed pissing contest between, say, the left and the right. We need to stop arguing about economic issues that are largely irrelevant and represent a false dichotomy that somehow thinks big capital and big government are somehow enemies with each other when they're not. They're all part of the same ruling class system.
That's the real thing that's lacking in today. We have everybody arguing about the Democrats versus Republicans, or who's more oppressed, or blacks and Muslims and immigrants and women and gays and transgender people more oppressed, or white or Christian or gun owners or rural people or whatever more oppressed, or or who do we want to have more control, big government or big business? It's all of these things in many ways I think represent issues that are intended to be divisive. The way I think it works is that the elites within the ruling class, within the power elite, those at the top of the pyramid, they have their own interests, and they try to rally different constituencies around their own interests, essentially for the sake of strength in numbers, but in a way that really pays no attention to issues that average people of any background should want to pay attention to. For example, if we look at American foreign policy, I mean, the United States has been at war consistently for something like 16 years now. We're currently engaged in military action in something like 7 countries. I actually saw a study done recently. It was done by a couple of researchers at somewhere in Pennsylvania, one of the colleges in Pennsylvania, that indicated that one of the reasons that Trump actually won the election was because he was perceived as the anti-war candidate, and that made him popular in the Rust Belt states, who are disproportionately taking the casualties of these wars. Now, because remember that the military is overrepresented, the ranks of the military are overrepresented by the rank and file working class from some of these kinds of Rust Belt communities. And it's these people that are being killed, these people that are being disabled, these people that are coming back from war with psychological problems and becoming addicted to opioids and these kinds of things. And that was apparently a contributing factor in Trump's victory. And yet there's very little effort to address serious foreign policy issues. I mean, there's no anti-war movement to speak of. As soon as the Obama was elected way back in 2008, the anti-war movement from the left just disappeared. And now that Trump's in, there's no anti-war movement either. I think this is something that really needs to be paid attention to more, and that's foreign policy. We see the Democrats going out of their way to bait Russia. I mean, Russia is a nuclear armed nation. The last thing anybody should want to do is engage in this kind of insane Russia baiting. That's another major foreign policy issue. There are still some in the Republican camp and the neocon camp who are pushing for war with Iran or pushing for war with North Korea. That would be crazy. That would make the Iraq war, the Afghan war, look like nothing. That would make those wars look like Grenada or something like that. So I think foreign policy is something that's not getting addressed, and that there should be more attention paid to it. Economic policies, I don't really see anybody trying to address serious economic issues. The most serious economic issue we have in the United States is class polarization. I mentioned how earlier in the program, I mentioned how the political polarization now is about the widest it's been at any time since the Civil War between the Democrats and Republicans. Class polarization is almost as bad. The gap between the rich and the poor is almost what it was, or about the same as it was about 100 years ago before the Great Depression. So that's how wide class divisions have become. Now, the United States is a wealthy nation. By world standards, in terms of per capita wealth, the United States is easily one of the top 5 nations, maybe certainly in the top 10 in terms of overall wealth. I mean, we're comparable to, say, Luxembourg, some of the wealthier European countries, or somewhere like Kuwait, one of these really filthy rich oil monarchies in the Middle East. But when it comes to class divisions, we are barely even in the first world. Like we go from being something like number 5 in terms of wealth to being number 35 or 40 in terms of class divisions. We have a class system that is increasingly beginning to resemble the kind of class system that you find in Latin America, with the very rich and the very poor, and what's in the middle is being hollowed out. So I think that there needs to be more efforts to take this issue seriously as well. Another issue is state repression. For listeners who follow me on Facebook, on almost a daily basis, I post videos of acts of police brutality, murder, the cops shooting house pets, beating up kids, attacking women, doing all kinds of things. Now, that's not to say that all cops are bad guys, or that that everybody in law enforcement is doing these kinds of things. I'm not saying that at all. But there is a very serious problem in the United States with an overblown police state and police misconduct that's fairly out of control. There's been a number of writers who've documented this very thoroughly, and not just people from the hard left, but people from the middle, people from the right, people from the Libertarian camp. John Whitehead, for example, is a one writer from the Rutherford Institute who's written about this quite a bit. I don't see much interest in addressing these kinds of issues, except for when one side can get some racial mileage out of it, like Black Lives Matter, or when the other side can say they're going to come and take your guns or something like that. That's not but it's the whole police state problem is something that's much more pervasive and more comprehensive than that. I think that there's probably too much emphasis on some of these demographic conflicts, the black versus white, religious believers versus non-believers, all these kinds of things. I think that, some of that should be toned down a bit. It's getting a bit out of hand in many ways. And I don't, societies that become polarized along racial and religious lines don't really come to a happy ending in the long run. So I don't think, people from different directions who are fanning that, I don't think are going in the right direction. I think that we need to consider a new approach to politics. I tend to think that a lot of the kinds of institutions we have are simply outdated. I think that the government is too big, business corporations are too big and too deeply entrenched. A lot of these kinds of institutions are relics of the 20th century. During the time when bureaucratic proliferation was the norm and fit the center of the times. I think we need to move away towards more fluid social systems of different kinds. There's a lot of different people out there that have ideas about how to do that, but I think that kind of stuff more will be the wave of the future. I think that the fact that wealth is being increasingly centralized on a global basis. I mean, we're starting to see a huge disparity of wealth now. Not just in the United States, but on a worldwide basis as well. So there's a lot of different issues of this type that are out there that I don't really see anybody paying any attention to. And that, I think, is the unfortunate thing. I think that instead, our politics in the United States, and what I can tell a lot of other countries as well, certainly in the United States, our politics is really just a glorified rivalry between football teams. It's like the Yankees and the Red Sox. I don't see it as anything that's serious. I see our political system as being more like a professional wrestling match. How does professional wrestling work? You have a couple of characters that are playing characters, with their capes and masks or whatever. They're representing some kind of caricature. They're in this contest that's supposed to be a real contest, but it's really just something that's staged. Both characters are working for the same promoters. And then you have the play-by-play commentators that are pretending like this is a real sport. And that's just how politics works. You have Mr. Conservative versus Mr. Liberal. They're taking some kind of stereotypical caricatured positions. The media is really hyping this and making it look like it's something that that's really important and that really matters. Ultimately, they're all part of the same ruling class, same elite apparatus. None of these other serious problems are getting any attention at all, almost none. So I really think that's what needs to change. People need to start thinking more about some of these bigger issues that I just described, less about this partisan stuff and different types of infighting. And I don't really see any of the major, certainly the major parties are not paying any attention to these issues, but even a lot of people on the margins, I don't really think are paying much attention to a lot of this stuff. When I look at what goes on in on the left, say between the whole left, social justice warrior, Antifa configuration, or the alt-right, alt-light configuration, or the libertarian ANCAP configuration, or the anarcho-Marxist with the black masks and black flags and things like that, or the or any of the other tendencies like that. The National Socialists, white nationalists. I think all of those are really just a microcosm of what the mainstream society is. They're fighting over the same stuff, only in a more extreme and fanatical way. So I think all of this is stuff we need to get past. We need to create a whole new political paradigm that moves away from all of these things, that's capable of addressing some of these big questions I've been talking about.
And like the question you mentioned, would you rather have big government or big corporations? Well, no one wants to ask the question, well, can't you reduce both of them? Not have a large influence from either. And that's the question they don't want asked, right?
Yeah, exactly. Why do we need either one? That never even gets addressed. I never see anybody addressing that issue in any serious way. Even a lot of people, again, on the margins, the libertarian movement is a good example. More and more, it looks like to me the libertarian milieu is just a microcosm of the wider society. They fight about the same stuff that Democrats and Republicans are, fighting about. Who's more oppressed? Conservative, gun-owning, church-going white people, or transgender, lesbian Muslim immigrants or something like that. It's the same stuff. The idea about challenging the whole dichotomy of big capital, big government, and pointing out how that's a false dichotomy. All of this is part of the same ruling class apparatus. No, almost no one addresses that.
Well, I'm glad at least we're trying to address some of that. Thank you so much for coming on. It looks like we run out of time, but would of course love to have you back again. And thank you for all your insights. It's been a great interview.
All right, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Excellent. All right, everyone. Well, that was Keith Preston, and as I said, check out attackthesystem.com to keep up with more of everything that Keith has been working with and writing. And stick around, of course, for the Stephen D. Kelly Show. This has been Beyond the Matrix. Until next time, transcend the construct. Regards.